to talk about the journalistic point of view and the local election point of view on how they go about writing stories. And I'm very happy to introduce Raghunandan, who is a former IAS officer who has been working on building more accountability and transparency throughout time. So we are going to start, the way this is going to work is Raghu is going to give a short presentation, and then we're going to move into a discussion sort of format on what it means to be an informed citizenry and how do we sort of look at the idea of sort of a citizen IMS. What kind of information do we want to know when we are looking at elected officials, when we are making decisions during elections? So I'm going to invite Raghu to come. Yeah, sorry, because to give a short presentation on some of the work he's been doing and his background, and then Nirbhik and Mira will talk. We're not doing them. Yeah, this one.
Morning. I actually expected to do this. By way of introduction, I was in the government and I quit. I was in Janagraha, started itedabbright.com, then kind of wander around now, working with a lot of institutions, both in India and in the subcontinent, and sometimes far afield. This is a bit of a cautionary tale, because it's great to have data, and a lot of citizens do have data. In fact, I think we are kind of inundated with data. So this is a more of a reflection, and this is why I thought it could come right at the end, on how do we use data, or do we really use data? Do we have the inclination to use data? So how do you engage? It's not about elections, because election is what you call the long arm of accountability. You hate somebody, you can only vote the person out after 5 years. But it's about practicing democracy on a daily basis. I've been deeply inspired by this gentleman with whom I was part of a faculty in IRMA. We taught together, and I taught fiscal decentralization, he taught democracy. And I listened to one of his presentations, which was fascinating. So this is actually John Gastel's presentation, modified a bit, and I will speak from an Indian perspective when I show it. What it means to deliberate democratically. This is about deliberative democracy. So what is the difference between democracy and deliberative democracy? So this is from the Jury and Democracy project, which you can see at this website. And conceptualizing deliberation, he drew a distinction, John Gastel drew a distinction between discussion, dialogue, and public deliberation. And public deliberation is rigorous and respectful. And these are two very important words, rigorous and respectful, because public dialogue can be very open-ended. You can end up not really discussing or not really actually determining anything. So how do you create a structure where with all the data at your command, you can actually begin to deliberate instead of merely discuss? Underlying motivations, why the hell should a politician want, or why should anybody for that matter want a deliberative democracy? Well, it could be the right reasons or the wrong reasons. It can improve the quality of public judgment, so somebody who's altruistic, who really believes that improving the quality of public judgment is really worth attempting, can try all this. But probably there are very simple strategic reasons why people use it. And I call all these people elites, the people who rule, the bureaucrats, politicians. It's very nice to have deliberative democracy because you can free yourself from responsibility on controversies. So Arvind Kejriwal picks up and he says that let's discuss in Mohalla Sabhas whether I should form the government or not. Whereas actually it is something that call that the party should take. But then he passes it on. It's a very good way of passing on your responsibilities to somebody else. It reduces pressure from marginalized groups, because always there is this feeling that people are excluded from decision making. So now you can include people. And the third reason is you can get credit for achieving public consensus and promoting fair and open public processes, even after you do exactly what you thought you would do in the first place. Right? So you want to build a nuclear plant, so you go all over the country and get everybody to engage and still nevertheless build the nuclear plant. And everybody feels quite happy because the cathartic part of practicing or participating in a discussion is kind of absolves the person who does something against your consent of too much of anger on your part. Now, deliberative democracy is a deliberative analytical process. It solidifies information base, it prioritizes the key values, and it identifies the solutions, which I think is very important. For example, in Bangalore, how do you do planning in Bangalore? And these are issues on which actually we should have deliberative democratic processes, but we don't. How do you design a system? And I'm going to give you 2 examples. You can have micro level deliberations. I mean, I help people all the time in rural areas. I work a lot in rural areas. So in rural areas, it is easy to have a micro level deliberation. It's fantastic to actually sit in a Gram Sabha and have small groups participate. And I've done this all the way from Kerala up to West Bengal. And it's very, very interesting to see how people take decisions and they moderate each other in that way. It is well structured. The discussion can be well structured. If you go to a Kerala Gram Sabha, for example, it's called a development seminar. Just like the Malayalis to make a big thing out of a very ordinary discussion. I can make fun of them. I am one of them, so it's okay. But it often lacks political legitimacy and authority as decision-making bodies. A Gram Sabha can make a lot of noise, can have a very high-level discussion, as happens in Kerala. Everything is a deep capitalist conspiracy or a Stalinist, shall I say, it has Stalinist undertones. But at the end of the day, who's going to take notice of what was decided in the Gram Sabha? Right? So that is the danger about having micro-level group deliberations. At the same time, macro-level mass deliberation can include all citizens, but there's very limited contact. There's very limited possibility of a really structured discussion happening in a huge, let's say a Mohalla Sabha. Let's say if Bangalore had a Mohalla Sabha and everybody landed up, you would have 15,000 people in a stadium. And what could they really deliberate upon? So how do you get this trade-off? Can you actually use data? Data is available. But can you actually structure a meeting in such a way that you get the best out of both? You get the kind of intensity and intimacy of a micro-level group deliberation with a political weight attached to a macro-level mass deliberation. It is being done. And we'll come to that. But let us first, before that, go into the kind of interactions that different circles of institutions, of civil society and individual citizens. How can they interact? And you will discover that there are a hell of a lot of different kinds of processes in which people and institutions and individual citizens can practice. It's not merely elections. This is the whole gamut of a democracy. Right? It's not merely the conduct of elections. It's everywhere. And you see in the various interfaces how different kinds of practices are best located. So this is the context in which we have to discuss whether deliberative democracy can really work. And if you look at one of the techniques that was used, it's called the 21st century town hall meeting. And this was actually a technique used to rebuild the city of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. What happened there was that you had a Gram Sabha. In fact, you had a virtual Gram Sabha because you had a huge diaspora of people who were in New Orleans but in other cities who were also part of this Gram Sabha. But this was not a Gram Sabha like this. It is not a panel sitting here and all of you facing this way. This was a Sabha of different tables of people participating. There's a stage right up there, but they were participating in small groups. Now what happened here was that people sitting around small tables were generating ideas. And these ideas were being reflected on the big screen there. So what happens is that if you're too modest or you really feel that your idea is not that strong, you might hesitate to say it. But then if you see that idea up there on the screen, it builds your confidence that you can speak about it at your table. So it's a kind of a swarm intelligence kind of an approach, where there is intensity of discussion at smaller tables. People who are shy and reticent can actually participate here, and big ideas are being captured across not only in New Orleans, but also in places outside New Orleans where people actually had congregated. So information began to get thrown out. So you captured both high intensity and large numbers in the same place. Obviously, you can think about 100 ways in which people who work with data can work in an environment like this. And this is what I would like, for example, a Mohalla Sabha in India to be. Of course, with our own variation of this, we don't have to exactly do this, but this is just one example. Now similarly, you could have what is known as the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review. Now this is very interesting. This is actually random sampling democracy. Have you ever thought of that? That a random sample of people actually can speak for public morality or the public mind? You don't know about it? It happens all the time.
I saw a story about this.
Oh, that's very nice.
About how in the end, using computers, they were able to find one random person to represent the entire country.
Oh, but you need not have gone so far back. It was done in India about 130 years back. And it continued till 1969. In what was the jury system? What is a jury? Why do you say that the judge and the jury should not be the same? And do we have juries in India now? No. We had juries in India till the famous Nanavati case. It's an interesting case, but lawyers here would know about it. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that in a jury-based judicial system, the judge is to explain the law and the facts to a randomly selected set of people who are supposed to represent the reasonable, I wouldn't say man, it used to be said reasonable man, but the reasonable human individual. And that's how decisions were taken. Decisions were taken by juries. Now, can you bring back the jury system to deliberate upon questions where where large numbers of people cannot practice? And this was actually done here. And this is what happened. If you look at the United States, the western part of the United States practices a lot of direct democracy. They have the initiative system. Whereas the eastern part is very much like India. They do not have a system where there is direct democracy, where people can vote, they can have referendums on initiatives. Now what happens with initiatives is, an initiative is where a group of citizens, there's a certain number of citizens, it depends upon country to country, normally about let's say 50,000 people. If 50,000 people here believe that we shouldn't kill dogs, then you can actually propose that. If 50,000 people vote or sign to that proposition, then it is put to vote to a larger group of people through a referendum. So for example, if you go to Switzerland, every Swiss citizen once in 4 months gets participates in a referendum. And the referendum voting ballot paper is not a ballot paper, it's a book. It actually comes with all the initiatives that have gathered in the last 4 months, and you've got to actually go through it, read through it, and say yes, no, and it goes back. And every Swiss citizen gets it. If you're abroad, you still get it, if you're a Swiss citizen. So similarly here, it's not so sophisticated in the United States, but you have a system of initiatives mostly in the western part of the country. Now what's wrong with initiatives is, if you look at California for instance, it's a state that proves, it's a walking, talking case for the failure of direct democracy. Because what happens in direct democracy is you can take a large issue and compartmentalize it into single questions which are very simplistic and which can be answered almost by gut feeling, but the end result of this is a big zero. So people in California voted to themselves that they cannot increase taxes, but they've also voted to them enhanced quality of public services. Now it's a no-brainer, you cannot have both. But they have been done in separate initiatives. So it's always necessary to have representatives who actually take a much more nuanced view of some of these bigger issue questions of how much to tax, whom to tax, what to tax. Because if you ask a citizen, every citizen does not want to be taxed. So that's not a kind of a thing that you would throw open to a referendum. Now here what happened was, they actually did a deliberative democratic process through a random jury. So the initiative was discussed for a week before a random jury, and the random jury produced something which looked like this. It produced a voter's pamphlet. That is, when the voter got the initiative to vote in a referendum, it was accompanied by a voter's pamphlet which explained in a very simple format, in just one page, right, what this actually means and what the decision of the random jury was on this. So the voter got a little more information than merely the question on which to vote. He or she got actually some information about what ordinary reasonable people think about the referendum, think about the issue which is posed before the referendum. This was produced by the jury, by the jury. The jury actually produced the pamphlet. It gave all the arguments for and against, and it gave the vote of the jury and explained why the jury came to that decision. Just one page. So you got it along with your with the issue proposition, and therefore you voted with some bit of knowledge based upon the judgment of a random jury of people.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
So doesn't the question become, the process become more complex in a situation like India where you have so
No.
diverse cultures in
Well,
just one constituency?
that's very interesting, because after I saw this, I actually asked the same question and I kind of mimicked this process with a group of what are known as Maldharis. I work in Kutch, right on the western side, where there are the Maldhari people who belong to different communities and castes, and they're basically Maldharis because they are nomadic people. Instant response, instant resonation with this idea. The question is, how do you communicate this? You can't obviously say it the way that I say it here. You got to speak in an idiom that is understandable by people. But Indians actually, I think, culturally, I'm making a very loaded statement. I think culturally, because we talk a lot and we interact a lot, all that we need is a little bit of discipline to convert that into a deliberative democratic exercise. And I have great faith that it can be done. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making this presentation. Because otherwise, you have a whole lot of data, and we all go our ways because we are all westernized and individualistic. Whereas we come from a culture which was very, very collective in nature, and which still continues to be quite collective. Right? So it does work. Having said this, I'm going to go very quickly about this. And this is the caution. Bad news about how people think and listen, very quickly. This is something that came out of what is known as a cultural cognition project. And this slide, I just need to explain this a bit. What happens is that we are all bombarded with information, right? But we all suffer from a selection bias. We know what to filter out, or we somehow filter it out. Where does that come from? That comes from your cultural orientation. So you filter out what you want to hear or what you want to understand in questions, very sensitive questions like caste, communalism, gender, right? And it all depends upon where you came from. Your beliefs, your way you were brought up, what you learned in school, whom you interacted with, and so on and so forth. So you select that. Then you are exposed to policy inputs by data, right? So I can produce data to you which shows that if you're a scheduled caste woman born in India, you live for 10 years less than anybody else, clearly, right? But when I show that to people who are anti-reservationists, they still might not change their minds. Can they be engaged in a process of deliberation to change their mind? Yes and no. All that I am saying is that we don't have this process now. Introduce this process. You probably will get a better outcome. But the problem is that people don't have the patience to deliberate. People believe in slogans, right? Which is why you can't talk about anti-corruption from a systems perspective. You speak about the Jan Lokpal bill, because there's instant recognition, there's some peg on which to pin your hopes. These are some of the worries that I think we really need to go through. And finally, I think this is our biggest worry. It's all great, it's fine to talk here in English, but how you are actually going to include underrepresented groups, the minority voices. And here I must tell you something, which is very interesting, that in a minority voice doesn't get expression in a democracy, because it's rule of the majority, right? So what are the other democratic institutions that actually are little overloaded in favor of a minority? Because a minority might be saying a very legitimate thing. It's actually the courts. And if you look at the American Supreme Court, out of 9 judges, there's just one WASP, one white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. The rest are all from some minority or the other. Child of a slave, child of immigrants, women, sometimes a combination of all of these. Look at the Indian Supreme Court. By that yardstick, in the Indian Supreme Court, out of 28 judges, we should have actually 24 representing the minority interest to produce the counterbalancing factor to majoritarianism which happens in a democracy. And that's the point at which I'm going to stop. So thank you. I went through this very fast, but anybody who wants this presentation can have it.
We'll be putting them up and send them out.
So I want to throw it to a discussion now and start with Mira, if that's okay. Yeah. Regarding one of the points is the media is a part of this process as well. And how do they go about processing information and stories and data?
Let me. Let me just take 1 minute to wear my citizen hat rather than the media hat. For some time from last year, when Bangalore, the High Court insisted on the creation of ward sabhas, right? The ward committees. I was part of one, and so last year when the budget was formed, and then our corporator asked us saying, why don't you guys come up with some suggestions for what should be done for 50 lakhs? I'm going to get like 1 crore or 2 crores, whatever. He said 50 lakhs you do, you provide your ideas, and the remaining I have my constraints. So, so we said, I mean, it's how we got selected was like random. We just, when this whole committee was getting created, we just wrote to the corporator and CC'd everybody in the commissioner and all that, saying, we want to volunteer, etc. Completely by fluke that we got selected. I have a feeling it was, he needed 3 women. It just so happened in our residence groups and all that there were 3 women, so he just selected us. Anyway, so we then we were wondering, okay, who are we representing? We are actually representing these 40,000 citizens in this ward, right? This is a subunit of the local government. How do we actually get their views? I mean, it's not like I want my road to be nice, but should this 50 lakhs be spent on this road or that road or some other amenities, right? So, and Bangalore's had some background in creating the huge ward sabhas, and that was done I think in 2004-05, and apparently there were a lot of issues that time trying to get a lot of people into a room and actually making sense out of that, and a lot of points that we talked about are valid there. But anyway, in our case, we tried to create a virtual community, try to create a mailing list with as many people that we knew about. We have around 300 odd people now. It is still does not represent everybody in the constituency. Very simply it's apartment dwellers and people who are online, right? But at the least we said, okay, we are representing this crowd. Let's at least hear from them. So when we were doing that, and some of the question that came was, okay, what's been spent so far, right? Which is where we ran into this issue. So that's why I wanted to show what kind of data BBMP has at the local level, and this is probably true across India, and how they share it. And these are fundamental issues, how which are challenges in how we make our decisions. Okay. Okay. This, for example, is a expenditure list. BBMP has FBAS. Some of you may have seen the systems, fund-based accounting management. This is how they actually say, okay, this is what we are spending on, right? You can see some submersible pump set in Jonasandra village. Where exactly is it? What is going to be the cost? Does it really need so much? At what level was water found or not? All this kind of details are not really available. Okay, so these are all PDFs, usually in hard copies. Just managed to get a soft copy of some of this, and they're not structured data at all. Another part is, they also do these program of works, how they create plans. It's all like one, simple table in a Word file. Right now with Word file, earlier they probably wrote it by hand. And when this is a kind of information, how do you actually challenge and question and understand the government is doing what citizens really need? Okay, so I'll just talk about one story that we had done, right? We called it the Great Kurumangala Park Robbery, because it's found out through RTI how couple of parks, it was just an example, they actually had spent about 1.3 crores in one park, Wipro Park, some of you may know about, and they found out how the tenders had been awarded. They were over the years, the fund was allotted in 2008-9, and finally it was spent in 2011. They spent twice on a fountain which was never built. They spent 2.5 lakhs on dustbins. So a lot of stuff. So, but how do you find this out when this is the kind of data? A lot of time when you talk about data journalism, you have data and you find patterns and stories in it. Here we are going back. Somebody expected there was some scam going on, used RTI, and then you go from the story, you go back to you use data to substantiate your story, right? So this is just wanted to show this example to say, show how data is available or not available at the local level. In fact, this is another story, right? For example, BBMP had 602 bank accounts and they said they're bankrupt, but they actually had money in some other accounts which was not considered at all. So all this, unless there is a structured way of storing this information or presenting this, it's very hard to find out what is the real story in the city. So with this, just a little bit of background to start the discussions, and Nisha may have.
Thanks. That's actually really helpful because it shows that when you do start maybe doing a deliberative process, there's information people do need. And how do you make sure that they get what they need, and what is the package and the sort of way to communicate it? So I'm going to ask Nirbhik to actually talk about packaging data and then the issue of getting it out into that deliberative process that you become.
So, if you attended my talk in the morning, I started by talking about what drove me and Pooja to begin the project in the first place. And the idea which we had thought was a little naively that, like New York Times and The Guardian, they represent data and visualization which allow people to understand what's going on in an easy format. Instead of having to pour through tables and tables of data and not getting anything out of it, you can look at a chart and get some idea of what's happening. So we started this initiative, and as the months went on, we started to wonder what kind of effect it was having, what were people getting out of it. And so we looked at how people were talking about our charts on the internet, and what we found was most people were saying, hey, this is nice, and this is something I didn't know about, and that was it. Like, we at the ballot try to present just the data. We don't try to present some kind of a viewpoint about the reasons why something is the way it is. We just say this is how it is, and it's up to you to figure out why, or how, or what can be done about it. And the result of that was, in the end, was that nobody really formed any kind of discussions about it. They might have thought something, but we couldn't figure out what it was. And so this brought back to the question of, at the same time, we were seeing that even people who had seen our data weren't actually using that data in discussions with other people about political matters. When you have discussions, when you have people from various sections of the political bias, like for instance, you have people who are pro-BJP, people who are pro-Modi, people who are pro-Kejriwal or whatever else, they talk based entirely upon how do I explain this? Say what the media is currently reporting, that's what they talk about. They don't usually talk about fact-based, data-based discussions on what's happening. And nobody tried to use what we had presented, what we had visualized in those discussions at all. So when we get back to the question of, this is a more fundamental problem. They have the tools available to them, but not using it. This comes back to the question of what Raghunandan was saying about deliberative democracy, about how you have to have an organized debate, you have to have people who are invested in not just being right, but in figuring out what is the right thing. So how do we enable that? That question is really hard to answer. And like, we gave some examples about how you can have gram sabhas or equivalents which encourage people who aren't just boisterous and who aren't just have an agenda or have a slogan to put forward to rule the discussion, but also ordinary people like us, ordinary people who have ideas but not necessarily have the push or the drive to or the confidence to say that this is a good idea, can somebody listen to me or not. I mean, how do you cause that to happen? Like in science fiction, for instance, there's a lot of stories of how the internet changes all this, how the internet causes discussions to happen in ways which anybody can go and say whatever they want and people listen to it, but that doesn't actually happen. So how do we enable that? We have all this data. and we make pretty charts with it, but how do we actually make people understand that and make people use it in a discourse and actually, making things, like I was telling Nisha a little while ago, that being informed isn't just about having information, it's also about being able to make the right decisions about the information and being able to discuss and being able to debate with that information. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Question just to extend what you're talking about. Right? And,
Mhm.
so we see open data at the Indian national level and it is being pushed as a policy. But what do you guys think about the role of proactive disclosure versus reactive disclosure, which is the RTI, etc., and doing this? Right? So you talked about the park. So how do we push the agenda in terms of really making sure that some things like how MP, MLA funds are used, just make it open to everybody. This is not rocket science. Many cities in the world already do it. How do we push that agenda in that direction? Because I think that's a great way of looking at the performance of your MP. Right? How is that money being used, etc.
So his question is, how do you balance between proactive and reactive data?
My question is, how do we push the agenda?
How do you push the agenda?
Proactive
Right.
disclosure?
Towards a proactive approach. Okay.
Yeah, actually there are already some, rules in place. For example, the RTI section 4 or one of those 4, it actually tells, civic bodies or whichever agency to share the information. For example, every ward office is supposed to disclose what their program of works is. I've never seen one ward office with this information. They're supposed to disclose it in their, wherever the public come, right there in the front of the office. Why is this? I think at this point when everything is online and it's much easier to find information, every information should be online. Whether what your plans are, what your budgets are, what your expenditure is, why is it, what all the tenders, they should be in raw structured format, not in PDFs and scanned thing and all that. So policy wise there are some. Implementation wise is the issue, so I think we need to really lobby as citizens and as groups, data groups, to go push for saying this is the way we want information to go. It's also what demand for this data, right? If number of RTIs increase so much, for example, that maybe somebody will be forced to say, okay, just put it out so we avoid these RTIs. So at some point we'll have to really look at increasing the voices, making it louder.
So I just wanted to ask a question and then we can open it to the group. We are talking about creating avenues to become more deliberative, to become better informed and become places where we can discuss more and demand more situations. Where are we missing? Is the structure there? Or should we be creating these spaces and how?
Well, in urban areas, you're essentially second-class citizens. There is a structure, but it's not a democratic. It need not be a democratic structure. If you look at the Constitution of India, Article 243 A defines what is a Gram Sabha. As the Gram Sabha comprises of all voters who live within a panchayat in a village. So the moment that you turn 18 and your name is on a voters list, you automatically are part of the Gram Sabha. There is no corresponding institution in urban areas. What you have in urban areas is a wards committee. It's a wards committee. And there's an interesting story to that. When the constitution was amended in 1993, some chap in the Ministry of Law changed ward committee to wards committee, which means that you can have one wards committee for the whole of Bangalore and you are within the constitutional bounds. You don't even have to have it ward wise. Okay. Having noticed that very serious flaw in the law, the other fact of the matter is that in 20 years, hardly any city has actually constituted these constitutionally mandated committees. And even if they are constituted, they are not constituted in a democratic way. One democratic way was suggested by the Government of India in the JNNURL guidelines, which spoke about a Nagara Raj bill, and which said that there must be area sabhas from where people are elected, and those people will constitute the ward committee for that ward. It hasn't been done except I think in Hyderabad, and I don't know if it's being implemented in Hyderabad. The law has been passed there, not in Karnataka. But I have a slightly bigger concern about urban participation. In rural areas, it's very easy to say that your primary interest as a stakeholder is in your village because you work and you live in your village. How do you classify an urban stakeholder? Who is the urban stakeholder for a downtown area where nobody lives but everybody works? Right? You cannot have your interest defined by as simplistic a measure as your residence. Then who looks after the big projects? Everybody talks about Porto Alegre as being this great participative process. But the fact of the matter is that in Porto Alegre, they used all that money to build local infrastructure, and there's no money left for the big infrastructure like flyovers. And the other thing is in urban areas, if you leave everything to small groups of people, you're never going to have any NIMBY project implemented. Everybody wants garbage treatment, but not in my backyard. Right? So where do you do it? You do it in Mundur, where the Gram Sabha sits across the road and says, over my dead bodies, you're going to send these lorries here. Till you do a treatment plant over there. Right? So the fact of the matter is that when you look at larger order decisions, you need different institutions. And unfortunately, the Indian constitution at least doesn't provide for any framework for those kind of structures to be created. So we really got to think de novo and design those structures, particularly in urban areas.
One question I have. What you delineated as an urban problem, is it specific to India or you have seen it in like other countries, and how they tackle it? So my question was like what you delineated as a problem, what you told, is it specific to India? If not, if it's like how worldwide it's a problem, how is it countermeasures are taken so that they address this issue? Probably this urban kind of apathy or anything, it's not India specific, I would believe. Thanks.
It is not an India specific problem. In fact, there is a very interesting saying that big government, nations are too big for the small things in life, and panchayats and urban bodies are too small, for the big things in life. The problem is that this is a really big issue in many, many countries because of the externalities of what is happening in one area upon other areas. But the way to counter it has actually been through inter-institutional cooperation. If you go to France, you have collective bodies of small towns to handle bigger projects, right? If you go to Switzerland, for instance, which is supposed to be a near perfect democracy, there's actually been a process of inter-cantonal or commune is a panchayat or town, inter-communal cooperation to handle, scale efficient projects like wastewater management and so on and so forth. So we need to have these layers of institutional engagement. Now, one of the layers which is in the constitution is the Metropolitan Planning Committee. It's not been constituted for Bangalore. Instead, we have what is known as the BDA, more fondly known as the Bangalore Destruction Authority, and the BWSSB, which is the Bangalore Water and Sewerage Supply Board. And you have various vision groups, self-selected groups of champions who are on TV all the time.
So it seems there's two distinct problems over here at least. One is the failure of democratic process in that engagement of people who are interested in being engaged. The other is the problem of getting people interested in the first place in being engaged. And once those people are interested, to get them to be informed enough to be able to engage themselves, right? So even if you make all of these available to people, people are apathetic. The average person whom I meet, who talk to me about elections, they're always like, I'm not going to vote because, these people are all horrible people, and yeah, there's the monopolies above options, but that doesn't make any difference at all. I mean, these problems, again, these same people, on the other hand, will violently, talk about, I'm pro-Modi and he will fix the whole country, or I'm pro-Kejriwal and he will revolutionize the whole country. And so how do we get these people to discuss, to have deliberative democracy as you talked about? Not just on the level of making institutional changes on the government level, but also about getting them to the point where they are able to do that. Right, so one can be solved by changing, by constitutional changes, enactment of constitutional changes which have been made for these issues. And second is how do we do it on the online ground where it's about engagement of people who want to not just want to make a difference but you know, don't exactly know how to.
Just one point there, but there's always this 80-20 rule. Majority of people will still form their opinions without any data or basis, right? So I think you need to look at the, it may be a minority, but the 20% or whatever percent who still are willing, who are open-minded and willing to look at facts before taking a call. I think we need to look at how do you make it easier for them to make reasonable choices. I think that's the first part. But even there, I think the structural issues of how do you, engage is still there, and I think that.
Well, you see, it's a little bit of both. The fact of the matter is that we see problems, right? And we seek solutions to them. So the internet and other processes excite us and get us involved. And definitely it does lead to a lot of positive action. I mean, for example, it's just easier to convene people and then get them all fixated on the same idea, and then they meet in real life and they do things. I mean, you look at the Ugly Indian website, or what's happening with Whitefield Rising in my area. And these are really internet facilitated and triggered off meetings of nice people who are all thinking the same way, and then the next thing you know is they're going out and cleaning places. Fine, that's really great. But there is a limit to which that kind of action can take you. It can solve a few civic problems. But for instance, you had a person speaking about why should we not track the MP lads, because that is what we judge our MPs on. Now that's not what we should judge our MPs on. We should judge our MPs on what they should be doing in Parliament, discussing issues that are in the central domain. We don't want our MP to clean the drains here. We have councillors for that purpose. And this whole process of giving an MP lads is a complete travesty of democracy. It's dipping into the pork barrel. Politics has been played in Australia, given up, played in the United States, given up, played in every nascent democracy. And we brought it here. And it's now a big monster, right? And we are being actually, now what we are doing is we're trying to make that monster accountable when we should do away with the monster. If you knew something about institutional structures, you would know that your MP is not supposed to do this, that he is supposed to represent you and he or she is supposed to represent you in Parliament. And then you should be actually fighting to get rid of the MP lads program. But instead of that, you are trying to make the MP accountable for MP lads. So the whole point is to get the institutional fix. I don't think the internet is helping too much.
That's what I'm trying to say.
This is changing the DNA. It's unglamorous work when you talk about institutions.
The point being that, like Mira said about the 80-20 rule, the 80-20 rule doesn't apply when you talk about the fact that what is the current trope of the system, right? What is the prevailing views of how things should be? The current prevailing views of things should be is that, people are doing bad things, so let's hold them accountable for it, right? The media reports on something and we want answers for that. Like I said, it's reactive. But in that sense, even making it proactive will not change much because we don't know what to be proactive about. Right? As you mentioned just now, that people are being held accountable for not doing their job, but we don't know what the job is in the first place. So that is again about making people informed, right? And how do we enable that?
Okay, we'll just go open up to questions.
I have a viewpoint about you were telling how to keep the people informed. I think the main problem is that we don't have enough data, first thing. Second thing, the data we have is not being communicated properly to the common audience. Third thing is the media. Like media always is biased. No matter which media it is. So, I don't know any media people are here. I didn't give attention to introductions. Oh, you're a media person. So sorry about that. Anyway, so what my question is that there are a lot of data that are still not being disclosed to the people, right? So as Open Data Camp, I heard it's a trust now, and trust means it's something like an organization. So if you take an initiative to approach the government with RTI or whatever that thing is, will you be able to get the data that is required? That's one question I have for you. And second question is for you. If you get the data, I'm pretty sure you did a great job in visualizing the data. Will you be able to take that data and put it into the public? It will be possible. Third question I have is, once that is done, if the people are communicated enough, like you said, there is a Gram Sabha thing in Kerala. I know because I'm from Kerala. So can't this be done through online, the whole thing?
Okay, I just want to ask about one point because I have the mic. You're still asking about reactive. I mean, you asking for data, or me asking for data, or him asking for data is different. You need to get to the point, like he said, get to a proactive disclosure. By default, everything should be available, right? That is the first aim. How much data will you keep asking for? Whatever we share, I'll tell you. I put it up all, everything is online. Every data, everything that I'm showing you here, it's all there available, right?
It's not just you, right?
Yeah.
Not just you, that's the problem.
No, not just me. I mean, how much will, I'm saying how much there is, data is like infinite, okay? You can't have individuals or organizations or media or whoever, you can't keep asking for, oh, I want about this flyover, I want the DPR of this flyover, or you want the MP lat spending of something else. Where do you stop, right?
You are a media person, you said, okay, fine, whatever.
Yeah.
Anyways, so why can't you put it up in an article sort of thing that all the data from today, forget about past, I don't care about past. I mean, whatever is happening from today, why can't you insist the government put it up online?
Insisting that the government do it is a very, I mean, we can all insist, you know.
I don't think it's a question of demand anymore. Data.gov.in exists, NDSAP exists, people are thinking about it. It's a capacity issue, and what exactly are we demanding? A lot of people for a long time have been demanding everything, right? And there's processes that have to exist and be in place in order for them to provide that. But what they provide also might not always be the best for us, right? It's for internal purposes and etc. So I'm going to put you on hold and go to the next question.
Can I have a question?
Wait, he was next,
sure.
and then the corner guy, and then the back guy. Okay. I'm just going to make everyone who wants a question fight, and the winner.
My question is to Tia, sir. So you talk. Okay, Raghu. So you were talking about the Australian and the US system, but there is a big difference between the systems over there in India. Over there, it's the legislative as well as the administrative. It's more like a capitalistic system. People coming in, people producing results, and that process itself, people producing results, recruiting their own teams. That is a capitalistic system. You focus on results, and that you put out results. And in India, and tenure of an IAS officer is like till you retire. Nobody can kick you out. So that creates a certain kind of cobweb scenario that nothing will change, we don't need to produce results. So don't you think that even though we are talking about this data thing a lot, is essentially a process thing?
No, if you say that a permanent permanent civil bureaucracy actually means less accountability, that may not be really true. I mean, America does have a spoiled system of the bureaucracy where everybody changes when elections happen and so on and so forth. But not so the UK. And there's a fair amount of information and there's a fair amount of professionalism there. Look at Singapore, for instance. It has a permanent bureaucracy. Or look at Japan. It has a permanent bureaucracy. People are recruited for life, but it's very, very accountable. See, the simple matter is this. Accountability means punishment if you don't do what you are supposed to do, right? Now, Section 4 of the Right to Information Act, which was enacted 10 years back, lists out 22 items of information that have to be disclosed suo motu. Have you punished anybody for not doing it? No. Punish one person. The government will clean up its act and it will do it.
Okay.
You see, the whole thing is that process for this fairly, what people think is a dysfunctional country. How is it that we run such a deadly election system? Because if you don't run that election system, you can lose your job. Even within a fairly, a permanent bureaucracy, the message is very clear.
Yeah, we're all here from the technology side of things, and we're looking at these questions. One of the things I've heard repeatedly in such circles is that technology and data are they do not care about, say, the politics of caste, class, things like that. I would like to disagree on that. And we've also, on the other hand, I'm greatly inspired by deliberative democracy and participative democracy. And we've taken the example of Switzerland, but which is apparently a new perfect democracy. Recent referendum on one of the things in religious
structures. Minarets were banned. Now that's strange. So that brings me to the question of representational politics. And my question is, how do we use data to figure out who represents who? One of the examples you had picked on was, out of the 28 judges, 24 should be from the minorities to counterbalance that majority and minority thing. How do you come to that question? How do you come to that figure? How do you analyze that? And how can we use that data in the future to figure out who represents who? And basically the demand.
First thing, when I spoke about Switzerland as a near perfect democracy, it's a near perfect democracy in its democratic process. I am not saying that what the majority thinks is always the right thing to do. But the majority did think that way. In fact, I teach in Switzerland, so I asked them that question and I did not get any answers from it. And so I told them in a fairly friendly way that, well, it's just religious bigotry on your part. And they smiled. They were at least democratic enough to hear me and listen to me. So the point is that we are, and by the way, I agree with your disagreement. I am not saying for a moment that a person in technology is not concerned about these things. They are very much concerned about these things. I only arrived at this by a simple comparison. If 8/9 of the judges in the American Supreme Court represent the minorities, then 8/9 of the Indian Supreme Court is 24 out of 27. That's the only, I mean, it's just extrapolating. But quite apart from that, the fact of the matter is that data, once it escapes or once it is in the public domain, can be used, manipulated by any number of people in any kind of way. And it is there that perhaps people who know technology have, in my opinion, an advantage of catalyzing a deliberative process in how the data is used. Because you know the data very well. But it's not necessary that you are the only people who can catalyze the deliberative process. What I was trying to illustrate is that there is huge promise in deliberative technique. And that is something that I feel is a gap in India, both institutionally and also in the mode in which civil society is engaging with the government at the moment, which seems to be more in protest mode rather than in a deliberative mode.
Hi. My question is on the availability of the data on data regarded 10. I have checked it out significantly, but what I find is that it's kind of lacking in the quality in the amount of data, the information to make any significant useful. I don't understand why that is. And B, I totally empathize with you. I know that the data is not all available under their control. So I want to understand what kind of challenges you face, if at all, in order to try to get this data from the other departments of the government. There's a bit of one.
The problem with just putting up spreadsheets on data governance is that the data doesn't have any context associated with it. You don't know, like, just numbers, even a set of numbers put together don't necessarily give you the entire story. So that is the deficiency which is there, indeed. But data governance is a start. I mean, once people start using it, and then the problem which you are mentioning show up, then we can ask for that context. We can ask for instance, I'll give you an example of where a context is lost when data is given to us in a simple format. The attendance data of attendance of MPs in the Lok Sabha is marked as yes or no. I mean, it's marked as zeros and ones, and there's also blank entries, and we have no idea what that means. And often we have zeros for an MP throughout their entire tenure, and we have no idea what that means. Does that mean they never attended, or does it mean they didn't sign attendance register? And does it mean they didn't get paid for those days? Have they been fired? What's going on? We have no idea. So these kind of, one naive way I can imagine one thing is that for every piece of data given, there's a way for someone to ask questions there, or to comment there and ask questions to clarify what this means. I mean, so this is the iterative process. We asked them to make it available, they have done something, now we have to give them feedback on that. And getting data from different people in different fields, that's something Meera can answer.
Yeah, I'll give you one example, right? The same MP-led data. So what you see in the parliament site is you will have how much did each MP spend per year, right? And they have some, slightly more, a little more detail. But to actually get the specific item on which that expenditure was done, you have to go to the local DC office. you have to go run around or use RTI or whatever. So you need to, this multiple sources for the same, piece of information. That is really hard, okay, to make sense of this. So once you get that information, see, the thing is this, for example, this MPLAT, these funds can be spent through multiple heads. It can go through the DC, it can go through BBMP, it can go through multiple things, right? So it's, for example, when we got this information for all the 3 MPs in Bangalore, we saw like hell of a lot of borewells, community halls, school buildings, and we've seen similar stuff in the MLA development fund also. Now, are they both claiming for the same work done? We don't know. Unless you go to verify that school and that wall that has been built, how do you figure it out? So I think that kind of illustrates the challenges of to making sense of this kind of data.
Okay, we are running out of time before lunch, and so they'll do 3 last questions. Okay. Okay.
My question is to Meera. You just started in the beginning saying that your own presentation 602 accounts were there, but they are saying no funds. But now after that, what is the later part? Because we have come through the media and all, we come to know that Bangalore is becoming the Detroit of India, like, bankruptcy, not money to be spent and all that. Is it true? That's number 1. Number 2, I'll complete. The reason that way it is becoming because there is no accountability. See, take for example lakes. That's one case which area I am continuously following since 2008 onwards. And there is a tremendous the shifting of lakes from BBMP to BDA to Lake Authority, and they made a Lake Authority by itself, and it is a snake without teeth in that, it's just sitting there, and these people will get the money, they spend the money, by the accountability is to be shown, it is transferred to another division, so that we can't ask anybody who is responsible, what happened on that. That's one thing. What are we doing to bring them the accountability on that? Not only for this, everything, because all these payments should have gone through bank. Okay, at least bank is a public sector where we can give them, see, whatever crores are sanctioned, there has to be an accountability for that. Through, if we can get it and put it in public domain, so many crores spent on so and so, accountability there.
First thing is, I think auditing has not been done. You can give the details, but.
Well, actually, the BBMP, and this is data in the public domain. If you go to the BBMP website, you can download their budgets for the past 3 years. Every year, the BBMP declares a budget of 9,900 crores in April. It is signed by the commissioner, it is signed by the mayor, and it includes ward-wise list of works, really transparent. Then what happens is, in October, it revises the budget. It's called revised estimates. The revised estimate is 3,900 crore, from 9,900 to 3,900. Now you don't know about the revised estimate till it appears in the expenditure figures at the end of the year, by which time the mayor has changed, because the mayor changes every year. So the mayor who declares the budget is not there to defend the performance of the budget. So there is nobody that you can hold accountable. Commissioners are deputed from the government. In the last 3 years, there have been 5 commissioners, including 1 commissioner 2 times over, and he retired there. So you cannot hold the commissioners accountable. So can you hold the institution accountable? And there is a big difference between Detroit and India. In the United States, municipalities or cities are considered as commercial entities. They are subject to the same bankruptcy law as will apply to an institution of commerce in India. In India, we do not have the equivalent of a bankruptcy law for municipal bodies, right? There was something introduced in Karnataka. We were a pioneer on it. It is called the Local Fund Fiscal Authority Act. It was drafted in the morning in 2002 and enacted in the afternoon in 2002, because the next day we were getting a loan from the World Bank, and they insisted upon this as a precondition. So everybody was happy. The bureaucracy in the World Bank was happy. They got their career promotions because Karnataka got an institutional loan. Karnataka signed on a conditionality which they were not interested in implementing. That law is still existing. It cannot be implemented because it is not a law. It speaks like a love letter. It actually reads like the government will adopt all possible endeavors to do this, and we will try our best intentions and best. That's not the way a law has to be written. A law has to say, if you do this, this will be done, and if you don't do this, you will be punished. That is not there in the local fund fiscal responsibility act. I can give you a copy of that. So you cannot, it's such a slippery law that you can never punish anybody for this. So we really have to look at budget discipline of the BBMP. And we do not have an institutional or a legal measure for that today. And this is exactly the kind of low profile, boring stuff that political parties don't want to discuss.
So, but now they have gone ahead with giving some Mayo Hall and all for security for taking loan, you know. What is going to happen to that?
Actually come and occupy that and set up a car showroom. You should actually do that. You know, in New York was taken over by its creditors in 1972. New York went to Gerald Ford, who was the president, and Gerald Ford used two bad words, which starts with F and O. And he actually did not give money to New York, and New York was taken over by its bankers. It dismissed the elected body and ran the New York City Corporation, and then it handed it back to the people when the body regained its fiscal strength. We do not have a system like that in India.
See, one of the reasons BBMP will not go bankrupt is because the state government is actually running the show from the back, right? They don't have enough powers in BBMP at all. It's, most of the money, the receipts to BBMP is grants from the government. What is the money that BBMP actually raises? Some bit of property tax, which they always, overestimate. They'll think they'll raise 1,500 crores and...
1,000 crores, actually is 1,700.
Yeah. So it's more like, they don't even reach 50% of the target. So what can the city government really do? They're also, in a way, so it's literally run by the state government. So in that way, I don't think they'll really run bankrupt that way. Incidentally, I'm going to share the budget, last year's budget. I don't have this year's budget soft copy. We'll put it up on the hackathon, so if you want to play around with it and try to extract, sense out of it, feel free.
One more question. Two more questions.
Hello, yeah, my question is around data quality. The last few years that we worked on data, this has been a bit of a concern that are we making, by data visualization, making bad data easily accessible? So I'm really worried about this because till now, all the policies are made by gut feel or what was possible. We looked at water data, sanitation data, agricultural data, and it requires a genius to look at those numbers. Meaning it is incomprehensible. We don't even know where the bad quality data is. So that's where my point about, I don't know whether you guys have seen, so that's my question. Have you seen bad data?
Where do we begin?
Yeah, bad data is as old as data. So I'll tell you a story about this guy called Narsaya, who was executive engineer when I entered the government at a tender age of 23. And he was a borewell engineer, water supply guy. And those days he used to wear a safari suit and he had a watch which made noises. That was the height of technology. And he never used any briefing notes. Yeshtu borewell ide Narsaya ee varsha? This year how many borewells? Sir, 106, sir. How many have been drilled? 65, sir. How many balance? 200, sir. Why? Sir, last year's spillover, sir. How much? 1,000, sir. And this would go on till lunchtime because everybody had to have lunch. So, bad day. What we have done, you're absolutely right. We've taken these narsayas and converted them into electronic narsayas. So, the only way that you can kind of do this is actually by ground truth. It's by ground truthing. Now, that is a big challenge for you. See, for example, if you can create unique IDs for works, including things like geolocations and so on and so forth, then you can actually make statistical data.
We are talking about good data. This is my okay. Talking about good data. This is my proposal for tomorrow's one of my hackathon. So there's actually scraping the polling stations so we could figure out where our polling stations are. Actually, ECI has it in one of its old sites I figured out at last.
of all Bangalore polling station locations. I scraped it, got the GSMs out. They're actually Google objects, so I need to figure out to make it an CSV and stuff. So there's a little bit of work left, but this is the present format, so I have to make it proper CSV for people to use it. Incidentally, there are polling stations in the lake as well. So I need to validate yeah. Make it a little difficult to vote. So I need a way to figure out to validate the polling station. So I can't do it by myself for whole of Bangalore. That's about 7,000 locations. I have a program which figures out whether it's on a land or on water or park, but beyond that I actually can't figure out where it is. So I need some kind of help with people to place it in location. What I was thinking is, if I give a map and you can